it. This is the Sabbath. Goshen. Goshen is the best land for cattle. In Exodus chapter 12 verse 40, the original black Hebrews, they sojourned in Egypt for 430 years. After 430 years, the Hebrews left Egypt and began the exodus to the promised land. Moses. Moses is Shemath. Shemath has been translated as names, and in Greek is translated as exodus, or departure, or a way out. The Most High, He led the Hebrews by a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire at night. The black Hebrews came to Pi-hahiroth. And they encamped in front of Baal-zephon, near the Migdals. They journeyed and came to Etham, and Etham is the edge of the wilderness. They left Etham and came to Marah. It is in Marah where they encountered bitter waters. After Marah, the Hebrews came to Elim, and Elim is where there are 12 springs and 70 palm trees. After Elim, they came to the wilderness of Zin, and it is in the wilderness of Zin that the Hebrews received manna, and it is where the Sabbath was first instituted. The black Hebrews crossed the Yam Suf, and the Yam Suf is covered up with the place name Baal River. The Hebrews came to Dafka. They left Dafka and came to Alush. Then they went to Rephidim, and when they made it to Rephidim, there was no water, and the Hebrews, they complained to Moses. They left Rephidim and came to the wilderness of Sinai, and this is the location of Mount Sinai. They journeyed in the Sinai wilderness and came to Mount Sinai. At Mount Sinai, the Hebrews received the 10 Commandments from the Most High. One of the commandments is Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. The word Sabbath, it is mentioned 172 times in Scripture. The English word Sabbath is from the Old French word shabbat, and the French is from the Latin sabbaton, and the Latin is from the Greek sabbaton, and the Greek is from the Hebrew shabbat. The concept of a Sabbath has been found in pagan religions that predate the life of Moses. The practice of Sabbath keeping has been found in Babylon and Egypt. The Egyptians, they had a 7-day work week where the seventh day of the week was consecrated to the false god Horus. And since the Hebrews left Egypt observing the Sabbath, this has led some scholars to believe that the Hebrews incorporated the Egyptian Sabbath into their own practice and observance found in the law of Moses. The Hebrews, they did not borrow the Egyptian concept of Sabbath. The Hebrew Sabbath has its origin in God, where God had a Sabbath during the creation week, and it is God that gave the Hebrews a Sabbath while in Egypt, and this Sabbath, it was a day of rest from the hard labors that was forced upon the Hebrews. The Sabbath was kept by the Hebrews in Egypt, and this is seen where Pharaoh accused Moses and Aaron of keeping a day of rest. And for that reason, Pharaoh, he made the work of the Hebrews more difficult. And Pharaoh did this by taking away the straw, which was needed to make bricks. In Exodus chapter 5, verse 5, Pharaoh says to Moses and Aaron, "Behold, the people of the land now are many, and you make them rest from their burdens." From this text, we see that the black Hebrews had a time of rest from their labors. But this was not a seventh-day Sabbath in observance to God. The Sabbath in Egypt was not codified into a system of seventh-day worship and rest. The Sabbath of the Hebrews while in Egypt was a day of rest from hard labor. The patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, they did not practice Sabbath, and there is no evidence of a Sabbath being practiced by Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. From Adam to Abraham, there was no practice of Sabbath keeping. From Adam to Abraham, these men, they obtained righteousness through faith in the Most High. Noah, he obtained righteousness through faith in the Most High. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, they are never seen observing a Sabbath. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, they all obtained righteousness through faith in the Most High, not through any ritual observance of a Sabbath. The Babylonians did not have a codified system of Sabbath, but they did not work on the 7th, 14th, 21st, and 28th day of the month. The Babylonians thought these days were unlucky days. Although this is not a system of a Sabbath, it is a day off from work. It is a day of rest, and this is called a Sabbath. The concept of Sabbath, it existed in Babylon prior to the existence of Moses. The Sabbath in Egypt was vastly different from the Sabbath in the law of Moses. The Sabbath in Egypt was merely a day off from work, from the hard labors that were forced upon the Hebrews. The Sabbath under the law of Moses, this Sabbath, it consisted of various offerings that were commanded by the Most High. It consisted of a temple, an altar that was commanded by the Most High. It consisted of a showbread. It consisted also of the altar of incense. These things were necessary, as well as a priest, lambs and rams and other offerings. All these things are in the law of Moses, and they were necessary to practice in obedience the Sabbath under the law of Moses. Under the law of Moses, the Sabbath is not just a day where no work was done. The Sabbath, it consisted of different offerings commanded by God, and these offerings were done and carried out by the priests. There are several things commanded by God to perform on the Sabbath. In Numbers chapter 28, verses 9 through 10, these verses, it gives and clarifies the performance, the rituals, the offerings that God commands on the Sabbath. The scriptures present the Sabbath in 4 different ways, at 4 different times, under 4 different conditions, set in 4 different geographical locations. The first mention of the Sabbath is in the creation week, where it is said, God rested from his work. The creation of the universe and everything in it gives a different setting where the Sabbath is first mentioned. This is significant because the Sabbath began with God. The second mention of the Sabbath is in the geographical location of Egypt. The setting has changed from the creation week to a setting of bondage and hard labor in Egypt. In this setting, the Sabbath is merely a day off from work, a day off from hard labors forced on the Hebrews. It has not become a law or command from God. The next mention of the Sabbath is in the wilderness of Zin. The setting has changed from bondage in Egypt to freedom in the geographical location of the wilderness of Zin. In this location, the Sabbath was given in connection to manna. The Sabbath has become a command of God, where the Hebrews are commanded to gather manna for 6 days, and on the 6th day, gather a double portion. And on the 7th day, they were commanded to rest. The Sabbath, it is now a system of seventh-day worship. The next mention of the Sabbath is in the geographical location of the Sinai wilderness, where the 10 Commandments were given. It is here that the Sabbath becomes a codified system of seventh-day worship and ritual observance. It is here that the Sabbath is connected to various sacrifices, a temple, altar, priests, lambs and rams, and offerings, and it is set under the Mosaic Law. At Sinai, the Sabbath, it has become a codified law connected to the temple and the tabernacle, and it is part of a covenant. The Sabbath under the Mosaic Law, it is vastly different from the Sabbath mentioned in the creation week, and it is different from the Sabbath in Egypt, and it is different from the Sabbath in the wilderness of Zin. The Sabbath under the Mosaic Law, it is set in stone, and it was structured upon various elements, such as sin offerings, an altar, a temple or tabernacle, and a priest. These elements are necessary in order to keep the Sabbath in obedience to God. The Sabbath is not just a day where no work was done. The Sabbath, it consisted of different offerings and commands by God, and these offerings were performed by the priests. There are several things commanded by God for the priest to perform on the Sabbath. The Sabbath under the Mosaic Law was not just a day of music, hymns, and singing. It was not just a day of reading the Torah and praying. There are certain things commanded by God for the priest to perform on the Sabbath. God commanded certain offerings to be made on the Sabbath. This is found in Numbers chapter 28, verses 9 and 10, where it reads, "And on the Sabbath day, 2 lambs in their first year, without blemish, and 2/10 of an ephah of fine flour as a grain offering, mixed with oil, with its drink offering. This is the burnt offering for every Sabbath, besides the regular burnt offering with its drink offering." The proper way to worship God on the Sabbath under the law of Moses is the following. Every Sabbath day, 2 lambs were sacrificed, one in the morning and one in the evening. The lambs, they must be first fruits, or in their first year, and they must be without blemish. The Sabbath offering was an addition to the daily morning and evening offerings. Every day a regular burnt offering was made. Israel was commanded to bring a male lamb to the Lord every morning and every evening. This sacrifice was done every day, 7 days a week. In addition to the lamb offering for the morning and evening sacrifice, Israel was also commanded to bring these additional offerings of flour, grain, pressed oil, and drink offerings. This was to happen every morning and evening. The scripture says, 2/10 of an ephah of fine flour as a grain offering. An ephah, this is equal to 33 liters or 8 gallons. The fine flour as a grain offering. To obtain fine flour entails a great deal of effort on the part of the person grounding it. This flour, it is not something one can purchase from a store. This flour is not something one can send through a mechanical grinder. The fine flour as grain, this flour has to be grounded by hand using a manual grinding stone. The grain offering. This offering, it produced a soothing aroma to the Lord. And only the burnt offering, grain offering, and peace offerings, these offerings were said to produce a soothing aroma to the Lord. The grain offering was prepared at home, and it was taken to the priest to be burnt on the altar. The grain offering consists of fine flour with olive oil poured on the flour and frankincense placed on the flour, and this was brought to the priest in the temple. The priest took a handful of the fine flour and oil with the frankincense, and the priest burnt it on the altar. And this is a fire offering of a pleasing aroma to the Most High. The rest of the grain offering that is left, that belonged to the priests. And this information, this is found in Leviticus chapter 2. Drink offerings. The drink offerings were included with the burnt offerings and with the grain offerings, and this was commanded by the Most High. The drink offering was done in the morning and in the evening, and this information is found in Exodus chapter 29, verse 40. The drink offerings included 1 quart of wine, and the wine was poured out into the altar fire for each lamb sacrifice. This is found in Numbers chapter 15, verses 4 and 5. If a ram was used as a sacrifice, the ram sacrifice required 1/3 of a hin. And if a bull was used, this required 1/2 of a hin. And a hin in ancient Hebrew, this is a unit of liquid measure equal to 1 1/2 gallons. Genesis chapter 2, verse 2, it reads, And on the 7th day God ended his work which he had made, and he rested on the 7th day from all his work which he had made. Genesis chapter 2, verse 2 has been erroneously translated, where scholars try to make this verse a reference to the word rest, where God rested on the 7th day. But the Hebrew word shabbat does not mean rest. Genesis chapter 2, verse 2, and Exodus chapter 20, verse 11 Both of these texts, they speak of an event that occurred during the creation week, and they say the same thing. However, Genesis chapter 2 verse 2 uses the Hebrew word shabbat, while Exodus chapter 20 verse 11 uses the Hebrew word nuach, spelled N-U-A-C-H, nuach. Genesis chapter 2 verse 2, that reads, "And on the seventh day God ended his work which he had made, and he rested on the seventh day from all his work which he had made." Exodus chapter 20 verse 11 reads, "For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea and all that in them is, and rested the seventh day. Wherefore the Lord blessed the seventh day and hallowed it." When we compare both of these texts and look at the Hebrew words that are used, both texts are conveying something vastly different from the word rest. Genesis chapter 2 verse 2 and Exodus chapter 20 verse 11, both texts says, "And he rested on the seventh day." And this is an incorrect translation. In Genesis, the Hebrew word shabbat is the every letters S, B, T. The S is the every letter shin, the B is the every letter bet, and the T is the every letter tav. Shin, that means sharp, press, eat, two front teeth, and divide. The bet, that means family, house, inn. Tav, that means mark, sign, signal, or monument. Shabbat, this Hebrew word, it does not mean rest, because the word rest was not in use until the 4th or 5th century AD. The English word rest is from the German word rastu or rasto. The German language originated in the 4th or 5th century AD. Prior to this time period, there was no German language, which means the word rest did not exist until the 4th or 5th century AD. The word rest was not in usage when the Torah was written. There are two applications of the word Shabbat, and both applications have similar meanings. Shabbat is applied to the Most High, and secondly, Shabbat is applied to his people. In Genesis chapter 2, verse 2, Shabbat is applied to God, and it does not mean rest because the word rest was not in usage when the Torah was written. Shabbat is not an equivalent to the word rest. Shabbat, when applied to God, it properly means God reveals his holiness. Shabbat means God revealed his holiness. This is seen in the every letter shin, which means sharp, press, eat, two front teeth, and divide. And whatever is divided becomes separate, and separate is the definition of holy. It is also seen in the every letter bet, where bet refers to family and house, and this refers to the universe and all things God created. It is also seen in the every letter tav, where tav refers to God and the one who sanctifies his creation. Tav refers to a sign, a monument, and this monument is in reference to the Most High sanctifying his creation through revelation of his holiness. Exodus chapter 31, verse 13, this text, it gives the meaning of Shabbat when it is applied to God. And this text, it reads, Speak thou also unto the children of Israel, saying, Verily my Sabbath ye shall keep, for it is a sign between me and you throughout your generations, that ye may know that I am the Lord that do sanctify you. The phrase, it is a sign, this is the tav, and the word generations, this is the bet. The phrase, I am the Lord that do sanctify you, this is the shin. And this is the proper meaning and understanding of Shabbat. Shabbat means God reveals his holiness. Exodus 31 verse 13 gives the proper translation, meaning, and understanding of the Hebrew word Shabbat when it is applied to God. Shabbat properly means God reveals his holiness. When Shabbat is applied to God's people, it means the family or the person that is separated unto God is a sign. This is seen in the every letter shin, which means sharp, press, two front teeth, and divide. And divide means separate, separate means holiness. This is also seen in the every letter bet, which refers to the family or the person that has separated themselves or himself unto God. And this act of separating oneself unto God, this is the sign. It is a sign that such a person belongs to God, and this is the every letter tav. Genesis chapter 2, verse 2 properly reads, And on the seventh day God ended his work which he had made, and on the seventh day he revealed his holiness to all things which he had made. This is the correct translation and rendering of Genesis chapter 2, verse 2. When we look at Exodus chapter 20, verse 11, we will see a similar meaning with additional information. The Hebrew word nuach has been incorrectly translated as rest. Nuach is the every letters NVH. The N is the nun, and this means see, continue, hear, and son. The V, this is the vav, and vav means add, secure, hook. The H, this is the het, and het means wall, outside, divide, have. The Hebrew word nuach, it properly means continual separation unto God, and this is seen in the every letter nun, where nun means seed, continue, hear, and son, and the operative term is continue. Continue is the correct understanding of this verse. It is seen in the every letter vav, which means add, secure, hook, and these things are connectors. They connect one thing to another, and holiness is connected to God, because God, he himself, is holy. And it is further seen in the every letter het, where het means wall, outside, divide, and have, referring to a separateness, and separate is holy. Nun and het means continual divide or continual separation. And divide and separation, both of these refers to holiness. So nuach properly means continual holiness unto God, or a continual practice of holiness unto God. And this is when nuach is applied to God's people. When nuach is applied to God himself, it means God's eternal holiness. Eternal is seen in the nun, meaning continue, and holiness is seen in het, meaning divide, which means separate, which means holy. And these things are connected to God, and the connection that is devolved. Therefore, eternal and holiness comes from God, hence they are connected to him. Exodus 20, verse 11, properly reads, "For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that in them is, and he revealed his holiness on the seventh day. Wherefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it." Nuach and Shabbat, both Hebrew words, do not mean rest, and they make absolutely no reference to rest. The Sabbath under the law of Moses is not forever, and it is different from the Sabbath in the creation week. The Sabbath in Egypt is not forever, and it is different from the Sabbath in the creation week. There is the Sabbath in the creation week, which is the revelation of the holiness of God. And this Sabbath, this is the Sabbath that is forever. Then there is the Sabbath in Egypt, which was merely a day off from the hard labors of work. And then there is the Sabbath under the Mosaic Law that consisted of various sacrifices and offerings and the temple and priests. These are the 3 types of Sabbath mentioned in the Torah, and only one is a Sabbath that is forever. And this Sabbath is the Sabbath mentioned in the beginning of the creation week, and it is the Sabbath that we are commanded to keep and worship forever. The Most High commands us to keep this Sabbath because we worship the holiness of God forever. Therefore, the Sabbath that is forever is the Sabbath mentioned in Genesis that refers to the holiness of God. The Sabbath is a sign of holiness. The Sabbath makes reference to holiness, and it refers to the holiness of God, and it also refers to the holiness of God's people. The Sabbath is a sign between the Most High and his people, where both are holy. Ezekiel chapter 20, verse 12, it reads, "Moreover, also I gave them my Sabbath to be a sign between me and them, that they may know that I am the Lord that sanctified them." Ezekiel makes it clear that the Sabbath, it is a sign of holiness between God and his people. The Sabbath is threefold in its application. First, the Sabbath refers to separating oneself from physical labors and daily activities and going into a state of complete surrender, submission, and obedience to the holiness of God. Secondly, the Sabbath refers to separation from all manner of sin and going into a state of complete surrender, submission, and obedience to the holiness of God. Thirdly, the Sabbath refers to a future event where those that are saved will enter the Sabbath of the holiness of God. Man will no longer fight and struggle against sin, because man will be made perfect and complete in God. Hence, man will enter into God's holiness. Keeping the Sabbath does not save anyone, and the Sabbath is not meant to save us. It was not given for this reason. The Sabbath was given for a sign that we belong to the Most High, and we are to worship his holiness, and we are to be holy as he is holy. Salvation, this is through faith in the death and resurrection of Yeshua. Hosea chapter 2, verse 11. This text reads, I will also cause all her mirth to cease, her feast days, her new moons, and her Sabbaths, and all her solemn feasts. This text is letting us know that the Most High will bring to an end the Sabbath, and all of the feast days, all of the sacrifices will come to an end. And this text has been fulfilled with the 70 AD destruction of Jerusalem and Judah, and with the 132 to 136 AD destruction of Israel. The Sabbath under the Mosaic Law ended in 70 AD during the destruction of Jerusalem and Judah. The temple was destroyed, and this means the Sabbath cannot be performed without a temple, priests, lambs, an altar of incense, lamb offering, fine flour offering, drink offerings, and the rest. All of these make up the Sabbath under the law of Moses. But this Sabbath, it came to an end. Today, many people, not aware of the requirements of the Sabbath under the law of Moses, these people do their best to practice the Sabbath according to the law of Moses. But this is done in vain, because the Sabbath, according to the law of Moses, it cannot be practiced today. Because this Sabbath, it requires a physical temple that has a priest, an altar, sacrifices of lambs and rams. It has a grain offering, pressed oil offering, drink offerings. These offerings must be performed by a priest in the morning and evening. And these offerings, these are the command of the Most High on how to practice and keep the Sabbath under the Mosaic Law. So anyone trying to practice the Sabbath in accordance to the Mosaic Law, that Sabbath cannot be done because of its requirements. And again, one of the requirements to keeping the Sabbath according to the law of Moses, that requires a temple, a priest, and various offerings. The scriptures present the Sabbath in 4 different ways, at 4 different times, under 4 different conditions, set in 4 different geographical locations. The first mention of the Sabbath is in the creation week, where God revealed his holiness to his creation. The second mention of the Sabbath is when the black Hebrews were in bondage in Egypt. The third mention of the Sabbath is in the wilderness of Zin. And the fourth mention of the Sabbath is at Mount Sinai, when God gave his people the 10 Commandments. Only one Sabbath is forever, and that is the Sabbath mentioned in the creation week. It is the Sabbath that is the revelation of the holiness of God, and it is this Sabbath that we are commanded to keep forever. When God says, "Be holy, for I am holy," he is speaking of his Sabbath, which means God reveals his holiness. And when God says, "Be holy, for I am holy," this is the meaning, definition, and proper understanding and translation of the Hebrew word Shabbat.